I was born in the summer of 1952 in a tight-knit enclave of working-class families nestled against the dusty hills of Riverside, California. Our little brick house sat 2 blocks from the city's steel mill, the massive silos and smokestacks always looming on the eastern horizon. In those days, the factory whistle was our alarm clock, its piercing call echoing across yard fences and waking families long before dawn. It told us without fail that another 6-day week was beginning, that my father would trudge off in his grease-stained overalls and steel-toe boots, and that my mother would soon follow her shoulders, rounded from sewing shift after shift in a cramped garment factory downtown. There was pride in that rhythm, hard work, honest pay, but there was also an unspoken cost. My parents believed that supporting a family meant never saying no to more hours or overtime. I remember reading once in an old parenting magazine, forbidden and hidden beneath a pile of laundry in the living room, that families needed time together to talk, to laugh, even to fight if they were to stay healthy. But in our home, that advice stayed on the page. My mother and father had no luxury of choice bills piled up, rent was due, and you kept your head down and did what you had to do. Sacrifice now, and someday we'll catch up. They'd say, never noticing how empty our dinner table felt without the chatter of shared stories. I was the youngest of 3. Maristella, my eldest sister, was already 12 when I was born. Too old to play dolls with me, but perfectly suited to step into the grown-up role my parents couldn't always fill. By the time I toddled around with mismatched socks and sticky fingers, Maristella was up before sunrise, lighting the little gas stove to heat up beans and rice for our breakfast. She ironed our school uniforms the night before and smoothed my hair into tidy pigtails before hauling me off to the school bus. I called her Mare because sister felt too formal, too distant for the girl who smelled of ivory soap and always greeted me with a hug, even before her eyelids were fully open. Between them and the factory walls, our home was a kind of invisible world. The clang of machinery and the buzz of sewing machines formed its soundtrack. My father's hands were permanently calloused, and his back carried the weight of every overtime hour he'd ever punched in. My mother's eyes, bloodshot from threading needles and squinting at tiny switches on the singer, saw more the flicker of a hem than the sparkle of her children's laughter. Weekends were sacred, not because we built sandcastles or picnicked in parks, but because my parents would finally be home long enough for everyone to breathe the same air. Even then, the repartee was sparse. My father sat in his battered armchair, listening to the Dodgers game on the radio, a beer sweating in a chipped mug, while my mother prepared a pot of stew that lasted us through Monday's lunch. I wasn't blindsided by this in childhood. How could I be? It was all I knew. But looking back now, I see the danger of believing that work alone could knit a family together. Our sacrifices bred exhaustion, and exhaustion bred silence. We never planned family meetings, never shared our fears or dreams around the table. Maristella did her best to fill the gaps. She would ask me about my day, quiz me on multiplication tables, even read aloud from Esquire when she thought I was old enough to understand more grown-up ideas. But in her soft, protective way, she couldn't replace the simple presence of our parents at every meal, every bedtime. Our neighborhood was bounded by the tracks where freight trains rumbled through twice a day, and by a row of sun-baked feed stores and auto shops. Latino immigrant families, families of Japanese descent, still reeling from relocation camps. African-American factory workers. Our street was a collage of faces and accents linked by the universal desire to get by. We shared each other's food when times were tight. Mrs. Ortega across the street would drop off tamales wrapped in corn husks, and in return, my mother sent over a tin of her fried plantains on payday. And yet, for all that community spirit, each family remained isolated in its own struggle. No one inquired whether the teenaged girl next door was shy, hurt, or hungry. We were each surviving our own frantic pace. It took years before I learned that many of the other kids in town had parents who could afford weekends at the fairgrounds, ski trips to Idlewild, or Sunday drives up to Palm Springs. Their mothers served sliced ham on china plates. Their fathers read them bedtime stories. I felt no envy in childhood, only a dull curiosity when I heard about a classmate's trip to Disneyland, so vivid they'd describe the color of Sleeping Beauty's dress, or how the popcorn smelled sweeter than ours. The fact that our fridge sometimes rattled empty late in the month never registered as shame until much later, when I realized that hunger could be reason enough for a child to believe she was less worthy than her peers. By the time I was in grammar school, the pattern was clear. My parents got up, they went to work, and they only returned when dusk was settling. Maristella made sure homework was done and that I combed my hair. Then the house grew quiet again, and I learned to occupy my hours in silence, sketching flowers in a battered notebook, reading dog-eared comics under the kitchen light, or simply listening to the tick of the wall clock and the distant hum of traffic along Pierce Street. It wasn't terrible exactly. We didn't starve. We wore clean clothes, even if they sometimes fell apart at the seams. But I can see now that children left out of sight often feel out of mind. I carried a sense of invisibility, like a secret badge, convincing myself that my own needs were too small, too unimportant to interrupt my parents' rounds of shift work. Had I known then what psychologists call parentification, I might have understood why Maristella's shoulders stooped with responsibility so early, or why I felt a pleasant tingle of guilt whenever I interrupted her chores by demanding to be tucked in at night. One evening, when I was 10, I found a tattered book of nursery rhymes hidden under the sofa cushion. It had belonged to my mother, and the pages were smudged with sweat and thread. She'd slipped it under the cushion to keep it from being used as kindling. I opened it to a rhyme called Rockabye Baby and read aloud to myself. When the bough breaks, the cradle will fall, and down will come baby cradle and all. I imagined its melody drifting through our empty hallways, past the closed bedroom doors of my sister and me, into the silent kitchen where only the refrigerator light flickered. It struck me that our house was full of unspoken lullabies, songs we had forgotten to hum, rhythms we had forgotten to follow. I vowed then and there that if I ever had children of my own, I would sing them every night, even if I was bone-tired from work. I would hold their hands, look into their eyes, and remind them that they were seen. That promise became the seed of something in me, a yearning to break the cycle I had learned so thoroughly. It whispered through the years of adolescence when I felt the sting of being invisible at home. It nudged me toward books and stories where characters spoke up, found their voices, or simply dared to demand attention. And although I didn't know it at the time, it laid the foundation for everything that came later. The resolve to write, to speak out, and to build spaces where no child would feel unseen. Looking back now, I see that our family's error was not in working hard. It was in forgetting that love needs witness. When parents labor so that their children can thrive, they must still pause, lean in and say, "How was your day? What are you dreaming of?" A single genuine question asked at the dinner table, or over a late-night bowl of soup, can steady a child's world more than any amount of rice and beans. It tells them their life matters, that their voice matters, that their story deserves an audience. That is the first lesson I carry with me even today, at 73. Never mistake busyness for caring, and never assume that silence equals peace. In every home, no matter how small or stretched thin, there must be a place at the table, literal or metaphorical, where every family member can speak, can be heard, and can know that they are finally truly seen. It began almost imperceptibly, like a tremor before an earthquake. At first, it was the way my brother Augusto would watch me at the breakfast table, his dark eyes lingering a moment too long as I buttered my toast. He was always careful, just on the edge of what might look normal to a parent rushing out the door. Are you feeling all right, Tess? I'd ask using the nickname only he ever called me. He'd shrug and force a smile. Just thinking. But that smile never reached his eyes. There were other warning signs. Small at first, the pinch when I passed him in the narrow hallway. The brush of his hand brushing mine. Accidental, he would say when he reached for something on the shelf. I remember one afternoon I was sitting at the kitchen counter cutting up an orange for my snack, and he stood behind me whispering, "Not so loud, princess. People will hear." His breath smelled faintly of beer, though it was only 2 o'clock. I tasted pulp and fear all at once. Nobody else seemed to notice. My parents' world was the factory and the sewing machine. Their hours were measured in production quotas and overtime. They'd give Augusto the occasional slap when he talked back or missed curfew. But they believed discipline was a cure-all. He just needs to learn respect, they'd tell each other over the din of the radio. Yet every harsh word, every leather belt sting, seemed only to sharpen the darkness in his eyes. I tried confiding in Maristella. One night, as the three of us lay in our cramped bedroom, 2 beds pushed close together so we could all fit, I told her about the looks, the bumps, the whispered threats. "Promise me you'll tell Mum and Dad if he ever touches you." She said, her voice firm, but trembling. Her hand closed over mine, and I felt her panic. She too recognized that monster creeping into our home. But when I tried, the words would twist in my throat. I imagined my parents' bloodshot eyes, their exhaustion lines, etched so deeply they seemed permanent. I thought of the last time I'd interrupted my father's dinner to tell him I'd failed a math test. He barely looked up from the baseball game. I felt certain he'd dismiss me again. Augusto's aggression escalated. He was expelled from school at 16 for fighting, pushing, punching not just schoolyard scuffles, but an alarming intensity that left other boys cowering. He came home with bruises on his knuckles and rage in his veins. Yet when my mother asked what happened, he said one word: accident. At home, it turned worse. One rainy April morning, the storm flooded our street and kept me home from school. The house was quiet except for the drip-drip of water through a leaky window pane. I sat curled on Maristella's bed, reading a borrowed romance novel by flashlight when he appeared in the doorway. His jeans were soaked through. His shirt clung to him like a second skin dyed dark by the rain. "Why are you hiding, little bird?" he sneered. I froze. I shut the book, refusing to give him any excuse. He laughed, a low, ugly sound. Then he stepped forward just one step, and I felt the walls close in. "Nobody's here but us," he whispered. In that moment, the world shrank to the space between him and me. I whispered back, voice trembling, "I'm studying." He reached out, cupped my chin, and tilted my head so that his eyes could roam across my face. "Study this," he murmured, leaning closer. And for the first time, I realized that monsters did not always snap their jaws in horror movies. Sometimes they wore the face of your own brother. Afterwards, I lay on the bed watching the ceiling tiles shift in the flicker of lightning outside. I wept silent tears that burned my cheeks, feeling as though I had been erased, replaced by something unrecognizable. I wanted to scream, to run, to disappear, but my voice was lost in a vault of shame. When Maristella came home that night, she found me huddled under a blanket in the living room, the pages of my book soaked with tears. She sat down beside me, wordless, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. I wanted to tell her, but the shame broke me. I only let myself whimper. The next morning I tried to eat breakfast, but I could not swallow. My mother frowned. "You look pale, honey. Did you sleep all right?" I nodded mutely, forcing my hand to lift the spoon. Augusto watched me, his mouth quirking into that same twisted smile. I realized then how easily fear could corrode a family. My parents believed the worst danger came from outside strangers on dark streets. Subway muggers, violent gangs on the news. They taught us to lock doors, to cross at crosswalks, to never talk to strangers. Yet the greatest peril lurked inside our own walls, in the beating pulse of someone we were told to trust and love. Guilt gnawed at me. I believed I had invited it somehow by sitting at that table, by being born a girl, by needing my brother's approval. Shame told me I deserved to be punished, that I had failed as his sister and victim both. Finally, 2 weeks later, Maristella cornered me in the kitchen, her hands clenched around the dish towel she'd been using to dry the dishes. "You have to tell them," she said. "I can't do this alone." But when I tried, my mother angrily brushed me off. "Stop being melodramatic," she snapped. "Your brother's under enough pressure without you causing more trouble." My father grunted from the armchair eyes, never leaving the baseball game. I felt as though I had fallen through the floor. That evening, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I waited until my parents left for work. My father at midnight for overtime, my mother at 6 in the morning for the sewing factory. And I tried to lock myself in Maristella's room. The lock, broken for months, didn't click. I was vulnerable. When Augusto found me alone, panic gave me strength. I pushed him away, just enough to break his grip, and I ran out the side door, rain plastering my hair to my face, cold mud rising between my toes. I flagged down Mrs. Ortega as she walked her dog. "Please," I gasped. "Call my parents." In the emergency room, they took my bruises seriously. The doctor, a woman with gentle eyes and firm voice, wrapped my wrist in a splint without a word of shame. When they asked how I'd been injured, I whispered, "My brother." That night, my father arrived at the hospital with terror on his face for the first time. He closed the distance between us in 2 long strides and raked his hand through his unsteady hair. "What did he do to you?" he demanded, voice low but fierce. I told him everything. The look on his face was more devastating than any blow I'd taken. He pressed his forehead to mine and murmured, "I'm so sorry." Up until then, "I'm sorry" had been reserved for spilled milk and broken dishes. I clung to his shirt, sobbing as he held me. The next morning, my parents reported Augusto to the police. He tried to deny it. He blamed me for fabricating lies out of loneliness. But the medical report, the photographs of bruises, and my desperate testimony left no room for doubt. He was arrested, and because he was still under 18, sent to a juvenile facility for 3 years. A sentence that seemed too light, but for a fleeting moment, it felt like justice. Returning home with my wounds bandaged, I found the house strangely empty. Maristella had packed a single suitcase and left to live with relatives in San Diego. She promised to come back. But those empty chair legs beneath the dining table seemed to whisper that some protections, once broken, cannot be restored. My healing began that day. Not with grand gestures, but with small rituals, writing in a battered journal, talking to a hospital counselor, drawing strength from the sister who dared to save me. I learned that speaking my truth was more powerful than any silence I had once kept. Over the years, I would come to understand the mistake my parents made. They conflated discipline with protection, punishment with prevention. They did not see that the most dangerous monsters often wear the clothes of family. They believed routine and fatigue could shield us from evil, not realizing that what we truly needed was vigilance, compassion, and the courage to believe a child's voice even when it trembles with fear. I woke before dawn, eyelids heavy with too few hours of rest and body aching from treatment the night before. The fluorescent lights of Riverside Community Hospital had chased sleep from my dreams, but they offered me something I hadn't felt in weeks, a measure of safety. Nurse Ramos, a San Diego-trained forensic examiner, greeted me with a gentle smile and slippered feet. She told me I was in good hands, and for the first time I believed her. She led me to a pastel examination room walls lined with posters about consent and reporting abuse. The starkness reminded me that this was not just a sickbed, it was a sanctuary for truths too painful to keep hidden. Nurse Ramos closed the privacy curtain and sat beside me, folding her hands around a stack of clean linens. "We're going to walk through everything at your pace," she said softly, her voice steady and kind. "If you need a break, just say so." I nodded, clutching the blanket to my chest. She explained that as a sexual assault nurse examiner, or SANE, she was trained not just to tend my wounds, but to gather evidence piece by piece, so that if I chose to press charges, I would have the strongest possible case. It felt surreal, my own pain transformed into something purposeful. As she donned her gloves and soft mask, I felt a tremor of gratitude that someone understood the dual nature of this moment. It was both medical care and legal groundwork. The physical exam was thorough. She photographed the bruises on my arms, the swelling across my chest, and the tear she'd hidden between my legs. All the while, she narrated each step. "I'm going to clean this area with warm water now. This swab might feel cold. You're doing great." There was no judgment in her tone, only a professional tenderness that allowed me to breathe through the stinging swab and the probing questions. When she detected a cut internally, she paused and offered an ice pack before continuing. I realized then that a nurse could be both detective and healer, gathering fragments of evidence while soothing my terror. After the exam, a victim advocate named Marisol appeared bright-eyed and calm. She slid into a plastic chair beside the bed and introduced herself. "I'll stay with you for as long as you need," she said. "If you want to talk to the police upstairs, I can go with you. If you'd rather have a moment alone, that's fine too." Her presence was a balm. I'd heard horror stories of nurses and officers who treated survivors as suspects, prying and accusing. But Marisol talked quietly about options. I could file a police report, seek a restraining order, and arrange counseling. Nothing was mandatory. The choice was mine. When my parents arrived, they hovered at the door like wounded birds, not stunned anymore, but resolved. They held my hands, their knuckles white, and said nothing. I didn't need words. We all knew this hour was about me, not them. Nurse Ramos handed them pamphlets on supporting survivors of family violence and slipped a business card into my mother's trembling palm. 24/7 sexual assault. Hotline-free, confidential, no judgment. Later that morning, I sat hard-backed in a sterile interview room on the second floor, the advocate Marisol on one side of me and Detective Lewis on the other. He was a middle-aged man with a crumpled notepad and a moustache that smelled faintly of coffee and cigarette smoke. His voice was polite, but clipped. "Let's review what happened." I exhaled and told him step by step Augusto's quiet approach in my sister's room. His threats, the rain pounding against the window, the way he laughed when I begged him to stop. His questions were surgical. "Did you resist? Where exactly did he touch you? Can you describe what he said when you cried out?" Each question felt like a fresh cut. But Marisol squeezed my knee when I faltered, reminding me to breathe. The detective's notebook filled with shorthand scribbles. He wouldn't share every detail with me, he said. But he needed the record. At one point, his voice went softer. "I know this is hard, but we have to be thorough." He looked at me as though he wanted me to understand that he believed me, even if he needed me to prove it. I saw the difference a structured, trauma-informed approach could make. In junior high, when Maristella had a broken arm from a skateboarding accident, the county clinic doctor barely looked at her, asked no questions, and sent her home. That impersonal shrug had crushed her spirit. But here the entire system, sane nurses, advocates, detectives, seemed synchronized in one mission: to validate, to protect, and to seek justice. Over the next few days, I received stitches for an internal tear, antibiotics for a urinary infection, and a small packet of sedatives to help me sleep without nightmares. A psychologist from the hospital's sexual violence program visited, offering short, practical exercises to manage panic attacks, grounding techniques like planting bare feet on cold linoleum, or naming 5 things I could see in the room. In a chair by the window, I practiced counting raindrops on the glass, the methodical rhythm pulling me from spirals of fear. Meanwhile, the legal wheels turned. My father hired a local attorney, Ms. Caldwell, whose kind smile masked a steely tenacity. She guided me through the process of obtaining a restraining order. At a hurried hearing, the judge, an older woman with piercing eyes, looked directly at Augusto and asked if he understood the order. "You must stay at least 500 feet away from your sister. Do you promise to comply?" He lowered his gaze. The judge turned to me. "Miss Simone, is that your wish?" I nodded, the action tiny but resolute. The gavel fell, and in that sound I heard a promise of protection. Still, I faced the darkest trial in a cramped courtroom weeks later, when I sat in a witness stand and repeated every painful detail under oath. I could see Augusto slumped in his youth offender's jumpsuit, expression blank. He offered no apology. He never would. The prosecutor asked me if I feared for my life. Yes, I said, though the memory of that rainy April day left words lodged in my throat. When I finished, the judge leaned forward. "Your testimony is clear and consistent," she said. "This court finds sufficient evidence to proceed." I felt a tremor of triumph, as if the truth I had once buried had finally been unearthed. Outside, reporters jostled for my reaction. I refused to speak. My parents flanked me silently. I realized then that my role was not to star in sensational headlines, but to stand for every girl who had ever been silenced by shame. In the days that followed, I received letters and calls from survivors across Riverside, students, janitors, grandmothers, thanking me for speaking up. One letter arrived in the mail from a 17-year-old girl who said she'd been too scared to report her own assault. She wrote, "Your courage helped me breathe. Thank you." I held that folded paper against my heart and felt my broken pieces begin to stitch themselves together. Through it all, the hospital and legal staff remained my anchors. Nurse Ramos checked in on my healing wounds. Marisol called weekly to see how I was. Ms. Caldwell walked me through every filing, every deadline, never rushing me, never doubting me. Even Detective Lewis sent a note when the final report was filed. "Thank you for your bravery. You helped put an abuser behind bars." I tucked that note into my journal alongside a pressed forget-me-not that had grown outside the hospital's door. I look back on that chapter now and recognize how flawed the world can be when systems aren't trauma-informed. Too often, survivors are treated like suspects, forced to relive their worst moments under harsh lights. But I was lucky I had a sane nurse who held my hand through every swab, a victim advocate who never left my side, a lawyer who treated me like a human, not a case number, and a judge who saw my pain as real. Their compassion and professionalism turned my personal tragedy into a testimony not only against my brother's violence, but against a society that too often turns its back on those who need help the most. Today, when I volunteer at local crisis centers, I tell survivors that the system can and should work for them. I remind them that they have the right to kindness, clarity, and unwavering support. And I carry in my heart the lesson that healing begins the moment someone chooses to believe you. In the hush of a hospital room or the solemnity of a courtroom, a survivor's voice holds power. It is a seed of justice waiting to bloom. I convinced my parents more by action than by words. One crisp autumn evening in 1969, I slipped out of our cramped living room just as my mother switched off the sewing machine for the night. I climbed onto the bus bound for the adult education center across town, clutching a second-hand notebook and a stub of a pencil. The building's neon sign flickered Riverside Night School, and inside I found a room half filled with folding chairs and a chalkboard scrawled with schedules. My first night back in school was an exercise in swallowing pride. The other students ranged from men in hard hats, who spoke of foreclosures and layoffs, to mothers in pastel cardigans, who politely poked at note-taking. There was an elderly gentleman who, between coughs, said he'd always dreamed of reading Shakespeare in the original. I took a seat in the back row, fingers trembling, and pretended the voices in my head, whispers of shame and self-doubt, did not crowd around me. The instructor, Mrs. Clelia, introduced the class as a safe place to learn and belong. She spoke of education as a gift, not an obligation. When she asked us to write a short introduction about ourselves, my throat closed. But after a pause so long the air felt thick, I wrote simply, "My name is Simone. I want my voice back." I read it aloud, my voice cracking. The room was silent. Then she smiled warmly and nodded. "Thank you for your honesty." Night after night I returned. I studied grammar until the chalk dust clogged my throat, practiced sentence structure until I could feel the rhythm of language as a kind of music. I discovered that letters on a page could be both a shield and a sword, protecting a wounded heart, yet cutting through silence like a blade. I joined the fledgling school newspaper, volunteering to proofread articles about parking permits and county tax levies. The editor, a retiring librarian named Mr. Stinson, noticed my red ink edits were firm but fair. "You have an eye for clarity," he said. "Ever thought of writing more than headlines?" His question unsettled me. Writing had once been my private refuge, poems, jotted in margins, scraps of story hiding between battered textbooks. I'd never considered it a profession or even a passion beyond survival. But at home, when the house grew too quiet, I would sit at my desk and let my pen wander. I wrote about the way rain smelled on dry earth, about the hollow ache of absence, about the fleeting comfort of a sister's embrace. Sometimes those words felt too raw to keep. I'd tear them up at the end of a page. Encouraged by Mr. Stinson, I drafted a short piece for the paper's special edition on new beginnings. I called it Scars of Gold, borrowing the Japanese idea of kintsugi, mending broken pottery with gold lacquer. I wrote of how our fractures need not be hidden, but can be celebrated as evidence of survival. I wrote each crack is a roadmap of what I have endured, each glint of light, a promise I still carry. Weeks later, the mimeographed newsletter arrived in my mailbox. There, in purple ink on pale green paper, was my essay, half the page framed by doodles of stitched ceramics. My name appeared beneath, in tidy capitals, Simone Alves. I held the sheet as though it were fragile glass, afraid it would shatter. My classmates clapped for me and Mrs. Sill. Clealia remarked, "You have given others permission to heal." For the first time, I felt the possibility of pride. As adult education continued, I made a pact with myself. I would not stop learning until I reclaimed every fragment of confidence my brother had tried to steal. I signed up for a public speaking workshop, though my palms shook so hard I thought the microphone might slip from my grasp. I practiced reading my own words aloud first to the empty classroom, then to a small circle of supportive peers. Each time I spoke, a tremor of fear passed through me, but beneath it burned a growing fire. When I turned 18, I took the entrance exam for UC Riverside's English Literature program. I studied borrowed college prep books under a street lamp, because I feared turning on the overhead light and waking my parents. On the day the admissions list was posted, I crept back to the night school building, heart pounding. My name was there, small, almost inconspicuous. But it was a declaration Simone Alves, future student at UC Riverside. The victory tasted like freedom. College life was both exhilarating and intimidating. I was surrounded by peers who had ridden camo-plated bicycles since childhood, whose parents could afford textbooks without second thought. I felt like an imposter, at first convinced someone would notice I'd faked my way in. But in freshman seminar, when our prof, Dr. Emerson, asked for a volunteer to read from Chaucer, I raised my hand. My voice wavered at first, then steadied, as I discovered the cadence of Middle English was not so different from the beat of my own heart. I joined the campus literary magazine Folio and began contributing personal essays and poems. My first published piece, A Sister's Promise, described the red kerchief Maristella used to tie my hair after a bad dream. The editors set it in a special insert called Voices of Resilience. I still have that issue tucked in a drawer, its pages yellowed, but its impact fresh in my mind. Faculty praised the raw honesty, and fellow students thanked me for giving voice to experiences they too had never dared to name. Simultaneously, I continued therapy with Mrs. Martia, the community psychologist who had visited me at the hospital. She encouraged me to explore narrative therapy, using writing as a way to reframe my story. In our sessions, I learned to separate what happened to me from who I am. I discovered that trauma could be a chapter, not the whole book. I practiced mindfulness, using the simple act of reading poetry to anchor myself when memories intruded. Over time, I began to sleep without sedatives, and nightmares receded like a tide. Back in Riverside, I volunteered at the very support center that had guided me. I sat with survivors over coffee, listening more than speaking, offering gentle reassurances. Your story is valid. You did nothing to deserve that. I led writing workshops called Pen into Power, where I asked participants to compose haikus about transformation or short vignettes about finding small joys. Watching each person discover their voice reminded me of my own journey from silence to speech. In my junior year, I secured a part-time job as a proofreader at a small textbook publisher downtown. Every proof was an invitation to hone my craft spelling grammar style. I learned to spot inconsistencies, tighten arguments, and ask, does this sentence earn its place on the page? The work was meticulous, and after late nights, hunched over manuscripts, I'd return home and draft my own pieces with the same attention. My dream had evolved. I no longer wanted simply to be heard. I wanted to help others find clarity in their own words. By the time I graduated in 1974, with a BA in English literature, I had a portfolio of publishable essays, a phone full of contacts at local newspapers, and a heart fortified by every deadline I met. My parents attended the modest commencement ceremony, eyes shining with tears. I recognized from years before, but now they were tears of pride, not grief. As I shook my dean's hand, I felt the weight of past sorrows lift, replaced by the certainty that I had reclaimed my life. After graduation, I returned to the Riverside Night School not as a student, but as a volunteer instructor for the adult journalism class. I introduced students to the basics of news writing: who, what, when, where, why, how, and then challenged them to write about their own neighbors, their own communities. I watched a retired postal worker find his voice in a story about letter carriers, and a factory line supervisor write a moving tribute to immigrant laborers. Each article was a testament to the power of giving people the tools to tell their own stories. That same year, I co-founded a small quarterly magazine called Voices That Matter, dedicated to featuring survivor narratives alongside information about local resources. We printed on a mimeograph machine in the back of a rented office, folding each copy by hand. Distribution was grassroots left at clinics, tucked into counseling centers, slipped into church bulletins. The first issue sold out within a week. I remember driving to a neighborhood cafe to pick up more copies, my arms laden with stacks of paper, thinking this is how healing spreads, one printed page at a time. Over the next decade, I balanced part-time teaching, writing, and community work, always returning to the desk where my journey had begun. I published op-eds in the Riverside Press Enterprise about the need for trauma-informed education, guest lectured at community colleges, and even spoke at state conferences for adult learners. Each platform was a chance to remind others that education is not just a credential, it's a pathway to reclaiming power. Looking back now, I see that rebuilding the self is neither swift nor linear. It requires patience, persistence, and the belief that words can change lives. The shy girl who once hid behind night school desks grew into a woman who stood before classrooms, microphones, and crowded forums, unafraid to speak her truth. And through every essay published, every lesson taught, every survivor who found hope in shared stories, I felt the golden seams of kintsugi, the fractured parts, mended, shining all the more brightly for having been broken. When I walked into the compact office space that first morning, I felt the same flutter of nerves I'd had on my first day at night school. The walls were plastered with posters, "You are not alone," "End the silence," "Know your rights." A chipped wooden desk sat at the center, littered with volunteer sign-up sheets, legal pamphlets, and a battered copy of the first issue of Voices That Matter. I took a breath and reminded myself this was more than a desk, it was a seedbed for change. We called ourselves the Women's House. In 1978, when I co-founded that small non-profit alongside Laura, the fiery young attorney who'd once offered pro bono support to our fledgling support group, our mission was simple: provide survivors with shelter counseling, legal aid, and a platform. What we lacked in budget, we made up for in determination. Laura handled court filings. I organized writing workshops and outreach events. Together, we scraped together enough donations to rent a pair of crumbling rooms above a laundromat. Our first client was a young mother who'd escaped an abusive husband with nothing but her infant son and a duffel bag. She arrived on September 5th, 1978. Labor Day, fittingly, her eyes wide with exhaustion and relief. We offered her a cot in our makeshift bedroom, handed her hot coffee and a stack of cereal boxes, and sat with her as she cried. By midday, she'd signed papers for temporary custody, a restraining order, and an eviction notice, courtesy of Laura's late-night drafting sessions, and we'd found her an opening in a daycare cup down the street. She stayed a week, long enough to heal, long enough to plan. When she left, she hugged each of us fiercely and said, "You saved more than my life. You saved my son's." That was the moment I realized that an organization's true power lies in linking services with stories. We soon expanded from 1 room to 3, thanks to a modest grant from a local women's fund. We hired our first staff member, Rosa, a warm-hearted counselor who had herself survived domestic violence 2 decades earlier. Rosa brought new programs, weekly group therapy, art workshops, self-defense classes. She taught me that healing can take many forms, sometimes through tears, sometimes through painting, sometimes through the firm click of a well-executed karate chop. Meanwhile, Laura spearheaded our policy efforts. In 1980, she was invited to testify before the California State Assembly's Committee on Judiciary about the state's lenient sentencing for offenders of familial sexual abuse. Armed with case files, medical reports, and the agonized quotes of survivors, she offered a clear recommendation: increase mandatory minimum sentences for incestuous assault and expand funding for community-based victim services. Though our testimony was only 15 minutes long, it helped lay the groundwork for what would become Lily's Law in 1984 legislation that added up to 10 additional years for families' sexual abusers and earmarked state funds for survivor hotlines. We celebrated Lily's Law as a victory. But we knew it was only one battle in a long war. Many survivors still fell through cracks. Undocumented immigrants too fearful to call the police. Elderly women trapped by financial dependence teens who feared their families would be destroyed if they spoke up. We recognized our own limitations and sought partnerships with larger agencies, domestic violence coalitions, legal aid societies, crisis, pregnancy centers. By 1986, we had formal referral networks with half a dozen non-profits across Southern California. One of our proudest achievements was the establishment of a transitional shelter in 1987. We converted an abandoned two-story house on Magnolia Avenue into a haven for up to 10 families. Volunteers spent weekends repainting walls, installing bunk beds, mounting donated bookshelves. I remember the first night a family arrived, a single mother with 3 school-aged children fleeing a husband who'd threatened her with a gun. As they stepped over the threshold, the littlest boy gasped, "We have a castle." His mother's relieved laugh echoed in the foyer, and I understood why we fought so hard for this open door. Yet even as we grew, we stumbled. For the first 2 years, we ran on goodwill, alone donations of canned goods, thrift store clothing, leftover wigs from a local salon. Burnout was our constant companion. I learned that non-profit work could be a slow drip of gratitude, punctuated by waves of overwhelm. In 1988, both Laura and I nearly collapsed under the weight of boards, to recruit grant applications, to write clients to counsel, and our own wounded hearts to tend. We realized that passion without structure leads to exhaustion. So we invited guidance from experts in the field. A consultant from the Ford Foundation helped us draft a sustainable budgeting plan. A trainer from the National Network to End Domestic Violence led workshop sessions on staff self-care. We implemented regular supervision meetings, created a rotating on-call shift to prevent counselor burnout, and established a modest but essential staff development budget. Those changes didn't feel revolutionary at first, but over time they became the quiet scaffolding that kept Women's House standing strong through economic recessions, shifting political winds, and the emotional toll of our mission. Above all, we learned the importance of survivor leadership. In 1990, we formed a Survivor Advisory Council, a group of women who had themselves experienced violence and now volunteered to guide our programs. Their insights were invaluable. They suggested adding Spanish-language support groups, extending hotline hours into the early morning, and creating empowerment classes that combined financial literacy with trauma recovery. When we listened, we improved. When we failed to consult them, we made missteps. Trust is built, after all, not just on service delivery, but on genuine partnership. As the 1990s progressed, our work intersected with broader movements, increased attention to sexual harassment in the workplace, the emergence of MTV's Speak Out campaigns, and landmark Supreme Court rulings on gender discrimination. We hosted joint conferences with local universities, inviting scholars, activists, and survivors to share research and strategies. The energy was electric, room after room of women and allied men brainstorming ways to reform education curricula, improve police training, and lobby corporate boards to adopt zero-tolerance policies. One banner day in 1995, we organized the first Riverside Domestic Violence Awareness March 300. People chanting, "No more silence, no more shame." We marched down Main Street in the soft glow of autumn sunlight, wearing purple sashes embroidered with our logo. The mayor read a proclamation declaring October Domestic Violence Awareness Month in our city. Radio stations ran PSAs. Local businesses displayed posters in their windows. For one crisp hour, the entire community was united in a single purpose: to break the cycle of violence. Fast forward to the early 2000s, and Women's House had become an anchor institution. We operated a fully licensed shelter, a legal advocacy clinic, a 24-hour hotline, and a community center offering job training and parenting classes. I served as executive director, but every success felt collective. The volunteer who baked cookies for residents, the funder who awarded a multi-year grant, the intern who developed a bilingual website. The organization's heartbeat was the sum of all those small, daily contributions. Yet in 2003, I felt the tug of a new calling teaching at the university level. I accepted a part-time professorship in the Women's Studies DEPT at UC Riverside, creating a course on literature of survival and resistance. My syllabus featured Toni Morrison's Beloved beside poems by Sylvia Plath, essays by Andrea Dworkin alongside survivor memoirs. Students devoured the reading, reacting with both outrage and empathy. Their term papers explored how narrative can dismantle stigma and envision new possibilities for justice. Watching a new generation take up the torch felt like the culmination of everything I'd built. Despite this, I never fully stepped away from the house. As a consultant and senior advisor, I mentored my successor, Rosa, who had risen to become executive director in 2005. Together, we planned a strategic vision that embraced the digital age, launching an online support forum, creating instructional videos on safety planning, and partnering with tech companies to develop a discreet smartphone app for emergencies. We recognized that crises evolve, and we needed to evolve too. In 2007, the news finally arrived. Augusto had died of complications related to chronic alcoholism. I read the obituary in the back pages of the Press Enterprise, his name, his age, the bland words, beloved son, printed beside a small grainy photo. I felt no triumph. Instead, I felt a solemn acknowledgement that some stories don't end with neat justice or poetic closure. He was gone, but the ripples of his actions remained in lives he had broken. I honored his passing quietly by making an anonymous donation to a rehabilitation program that served inmates and ex-offenders, believing perhaps that no cycle of violence should go unchallenged, no matter what side of the bars a soul occupies. Because I knew that if healing is possible for a survivor like me, then society must also invest in the rehabilitation of those who harm. Now, in the spring of 2025, the Women's House stands at a crossroads of new opportunities and challenges. Funding landscapes have shifted. The COVID-19 pandemic's lessons still resonate in how we deliver services remotely. The national conversation around gender-based violence is more urgent than ever. Yet our core truths endure. Survivors know best what they need. Prevention must pair with accountability, and a single voice raised in truth can reverberate across generations. My final message to every woman, every man, every ally watching is that you are not powerless. Whether you volunteer to drive a client to court, donate a few dollars to a 24-hour hotline, sign a petition to change your state's laws, or simply listen without judgment to someone's story, you are stitching golden seams into the broken pottery of our world. Your actions, however small, ripple outward. So I invite you, find your local shelter, offer your time. Share this video with friends, call your representatives, and demand stronger protections for survivors. If you have your own story, know that your scars can be a beacon for others. And if you are still silenced, still afraid to speak, remember that there are people waiting, nurse examiners, victim advocates, attorneys, volunteers, who will believe you, support you, and stand with you. Together we are seeds sprouting through concrete, and together we will bloom.